For doing a talk like this, it's always complicated to know exactly what level to pitch it. Part of me wants to pitch it at sort of totally academic and get it all exactly right, and part of me knows that I want to be talking to people who don't know very much, if anything at all. So I'm trying to do a balance where mostly I want to give you an experience of the meadows with a little bit of information. That means you may find that if you do know a lot, it's a little bit light. If you don't know much, don't worry, there aren't that many slides of information. Most of it, I hope, is mostly it's visual, with some information about what we've been doing in terms of the history. One of the things that makes me feel that we're doing the right thing at Sunrising is when I have a visitor that says, especially in springtime, they look around and they see the cowslips and they say, that reminds me of when I was young. And one of the reasons that makes me feel like we're doing the right thing is because we're losing our meadows, or we have lost most of our meadows. And this is one of the less than half a dozen slides of information. 97% of traditional wildflower meadow has been lost since the 1930s. That's 7.5 million acres. We all know the figures, or we know something like them, but it's really hard to actually see them. In the campaign to increase food production after the World War II, 6 million acres of ancient flower meadow were ploughed for cereals. Intensive agriculture, of course, part of the process of growing food for more people, of trying to be self-sufficient in food, which of course we're not at all anymore, but we were trying after the war, and urban development have destroyed it. What we have left are scattered fragments. But what do we mean by a wildflower meadow? What is a wildflower meadow? First of all, I'll say what it isn't. It's not a cornflower meadow. A lot of people say, oh, can we put cornflowers and can we put poppies and can we put this and that? These are what we call arable weeds. They're pretty arable weeds, like cornflowers, corn chamomile, corn marigold, and of course the poppy. But there are also not so pretty arable weeds like fat hen, charlock, or the chenopodiums, ox tongues. What arable weeds need is disturbed ground, in other words, the plough. The reason we don't see very many is because they are sprayed out, not only on the ground, but they're sprayed out in seed mixes. So when a farmer gets his bag of wheat grain, all the little seeds, the weed seeds, are taken out. So right in the beginning and through the process of growing corn, wheat, barley, oats, whatever it may be, these little things are mostly destroyed. And they have a nostalgic feel, but it's not a wildflower meadow. Something that's very popular at the moment is a pictorial meadow. And there you can buy little seed packets, which they say are wildflower seeds, but they're not native seed mixes. They're pictorial seeds, and most of these are garden variety seeds, plants, and non-natives. It makes it prettier. It extends the flowering season, but it's not native, and it doesn't support the biodiversity of a wildflower meadow. So what a wildflower meadow really is a native species-rich grassland. And that also tells you something else. It needs grass, not just flowers. The biodiversity of an all-native meadow is hugely higher than any other mix with non-natives and garden variety plants, because every plant in that mix has evolved and adapted to the environment where it's growing. And so all the little seed, the earth organisms, all the little invertebrates, all the birds, and going up the food chain, the whole ecosystem works. When we began Sunrising, we knew that we wanted to create a nature reserve, not a green burial ground or a garden burial ground or a woodland burial ground. We wanted to create a nature reserve. That includes different habitats. The wildflower meadow was a part of that. The native copses of woodland, of hedgerows, the pond, the grasses, but also wildflower meadow. The figure that's often used is that a wildflower meadow, or a native species-rich grassland, can have 40 species of plant per square metre, compared with the average grassland, which has 15 species. The value to wildlife is not just in the soil fauna, but also, of course, all the invertebrates, bees, hoverflies, butterflies, moths, ants, spiders, grasshoppers, and crickets, and the birds, which we all know, skylarks, curlews, lapwings, barn owls, green woodpeckers. But something we don't often know, and is increasingly important and brought to mind, is that a wildflower meadow, a species-rich grassland, is really important for carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is absorbed, or carbon is absorbed into the soil as organic matter and is likely to remain there. It's captured in the soil. In woodland, where trees are grown and then felled as plantation, you're losing that carbon. If the meadow is cut, as long as you aren't ploughing, then the roots continue to absorb and to hold that carbon in the soil. So actually what some people are saying is that a wildflower meadow, the ratio is 1.4 acres of wildflower meadow are equal to 3 acres of woodland in terms of carbon dioxide. So if you're thinking about, we should be planting trees to absorb carbon dioxide, actually we should be looking at wildflower meadows and maintaining and preserving and creating wildflower meadows. Traditional hay meadows. So how do you create a wildflower meadow? Or how did our forebears do it? Leaving land alone just creates scrub, as you all know. The maple seeds come in, the blackthorn encroaches, you get little trees coming up and it's scrub. A traditional hay meadow is maintained because of livestock. So as a natural burial ground, we were starting with a wholly different premise from those used in pastoral or agricultural ideas. In other words, or even small holdings or estates, we were not using livestock. So how do you create a natural burial, a wildflower meadow without livestock? Or let's have a look at it, how they did with livestock. The hay meadow is left to grow from Lady Day, the end of March, through to around midsummer, or a bit later, depending on the weather, when the grass is thick and rich, and then it's cut, dried, rowed, baled for grass, which then goes for winter fodder for the livestock. And then when the grass comes through the stubble again, it greens, then the meadow becomes pasture again, perhaps until All Hallows, Samhain, November, and then it's left because livestock need to go indoors or they'll start puddling the soil. So you leave it until Lady Day, it starts to grow again in March, until midsummer again. But that's the cycle, and that requires livestock. So what do you do without livestock? Some of you might have seen this picture. This is Sunrising Natural Burial Ground and Nature Reserve. This was actually taken in 2006. The old field called Ippel, which was part of Lower Tysoe Field, and our little section was called Ippel. That's the view if you were standing on around the mown square or the meadow just behind the roundhouse, looking towards the main car park. So that's where we began. That's not even the car park's in. We just put the car park in and the fence. We haven't planted the hedge. So this is the fence, and that's the gate just taken around the main car park, and that was taken in April 2006. Just seeing if I can get a pointer. No. I'm going to tell you that that's pretty much the view now. Taken a few steps forward, but that's where we are now. So as far as we can work out, since the enclosures in the late 18th century, Ippel, our field, was in pasture and hay, growing grass, until the 1940s. And then after the war, it was a part of that great urge to grow more food, and the ridge and furrow, because at that point it was still in ridge and furrow, the ridge and furrow was cross-ploughed to level, and then for about 20 years they tried to grow cereals, very hard. They gave up. and in the 1960s it went back to hay. And they grew grass on this field basically from the 1960s until we took over. And this is in 2006, this is the first year, and we carried on. What could we do with all that grass? We didn't know what to do, so we just carried on taking the hay off while we started to adapt and bury in the corner. But we had plans. We wanted a nature reserve with woodland copses and hedges and the pond and grass, but also the wildflower meadows. So how do you make a wildflower meadow? I often say to people, I didn't want to find somewhere that was beautiful and mess around with it. I wanted to find somewhere that needed work to create a wonderful nature reserve. I wanted to create a nature reserve from scratch to show people that it's possible to do. And a huge part of that is the wildflower meadow. So there are three ways. Either restoration. In other words, leave it. Don't do anything to it. Just leave it and see what's there. Sometimes that works, not often, because you end up with scrub, and not often unless you've got livestock. But sometimes it's important to see what's there. The other eye is bare ground. You have to clear the grass or whatever's there, the scrub. You have to plough. You have to harrow, so you've got a seed bed, and you have to sow with new seed. And the third way, which a lot of people are talking about now, is green hay, where the hay, rich with seed, wildflower seed, is taken from another nature reserve or wildflower meadow and spread in your land. And I'll show you how we've used those three different kinds of creation method. But you've also got to be careful of your soil. You've got to know what the pH is and what soil type. So you need to know what's there. You can see here with a small tortoiseshell on a bit of our baked clay. There's no point in us planting wildflower seed for plants that need a soft, sandy or an acidic soil. We've got almost just heading into alkaline clay soil. You also have to be very careful about your soil fertility. A lot of people try to grow wildflower seed straight away in land which has been fertilised. Or it's been rich because you've been composting it in the garden. And if you've been cutting grass and leaving the grass to mulch in whenever you cut your lawn, and then you take it and decide you want a wildflower meadow, well, actually the soil underneath your lawn is quite rich if you never take off the grass. So you won't manage a wildflower meadow very easily. Lovely bunch of nettles there. Because in rich fertility soil, you get a lot of weeds, wasteland weeds, or weeds that you find in areas on the edge of human development. So if human beings have been walking around, you'll see the trail of where they've been by rows of nettles. You'll see ways where if someone scatters just a little bit of ash, a dog's ashes at sunrising, we know it because you get a stand of nettles. The wildflowers are killed, you get rich, thick grass, and nettles come up. So we know when people are disobeying our rules, don't scatter ashes because they are a fertility, blood, fish and bone on your roses. If you put ash, you'll get the same thing, rich soil. Weeds are wonderful. Here you can see in this picture dock and creeping thistle and a few spear thistles. And we keep these to the ruderal edge. But we don't want them in the wildflower meadow. So you also have to be aware, of what seeds are already in the soil. So it's the pH and the fertility of the soil, the kind of soil you've got, and you have to be aware of what seeds are already there in the seed bank. And creeping thistle is a big one. In our last talk in the AGM, you saw this vision map. Here I'm going to show you the first area where we created Wildflower Meadow. We call it Betty's and Marjorie's. Betty's is on the left and Marjorie's meadow is on the right of the track that goes from the car park to the roundhouse. Betty was the first to be buried on the left, Marjorie was the first to be buried on the right. So we began here with our first stretch of meadow. We had left it for a couple of years. This is 2008. Nothing had come up. The grass was still rich, the ground was still too fertile. All we had was grass. And we didn't know much about green hay then. We were still starting out. We were still learning. In 2008, in one little area, we did find common spotted orchids. Not where we'd left the grass completely, but where we had mowed a little around the edges, because the common spotted orchid likes it when you mow it 2 or 3 times a year. Not once, because it gets overwhelmed. At first, that's what we thought in the beginning. Gets overwhelmed, but not on the edge where you keep mowing it. But mow it once or twice. Maybe we've mown it in May, and then it comes up, or we've mown it in March, or whatever. Then it comes up. It's got a little bit more space, a little bit more air, a little bit more sunshine. And the common spotted orchids started to come by themselves in 2008. But otherwise, there was nothing in our land. So we decided to go for the bare ground. Clear, plough, harrow and sow. The advantages? Well, you can choose the seed that you want and you might get a fairly quick result. The compromise is you have to spray out the grass. So you're using a glyphosate to get rid of the grass. There's no other way. If you turn it over, all you do is just suppress the grass roots and then they come up again. You have to start with a glyphosate. The possible problems? Well, the quality of seed that you're getting. I think these are bikers passing. The quality of seeds, and also weeds are churned up by the plough, or weeds that like bare ground. So if you've got bare ground, you're just opening an invitation to everybody. The seed mix, so we tried 1/2 acre, and the seed mix we used was from a reputable source. A standard mix, though, for clay soil, which was 80% grass seed and 20% wildflower seed, which is the standard mix for a species-rich native grassland. Around the edges, we did quite well. This is what you say, 2009, year 1. Around the edges where there was light, we had quite a few wildflowers. You can see here Oxide Daisies and red clover and a bit of common sorrel in there. In terms of what was there already, dandelions. We had a lot of dandelions. In the top half of the site, not in the bottom, but in the top half of the site we had dandelions. Beautiful, really important for bees, but in some areas very dominant. And we still have little pockets of dominant dandelions. But they didn't come up in the area that we had prepared and sown. We didn't get any. What we did get was charlock. Charlock is the native version of oilseed rape. It's a brassica, and it likes disturbed ground. And this area, which is actually Betty's meadow, and the other side, was totally dominated by charlock. This is June. It was dominated through May and June with charlock. We panicked. Part of the reason we panicked is because farmers who came along were very cynical and very unsurprised. Well, of course, if you're going to just do that, of course you're going to get charlock. You need to get rid of it. What we thought was, God, we better get rid of it. And we started weeding. And we weeded, out of all of that 1/2 acre, we weeded about 2/3 of it before I said, hang on a minute, this isn't annual. The seeds are pods. What if we left it? Charlock likes disturbed ground. We're not going to be ploughing or disturbing this ground anymore, so there's no point. We left a whole section, about half, just over half, of Marjorie's meadow, and the following year it made no difference whatsoever. Where we'd weeded and where we hadn't weeded, the charlock did not return. So the farmers, with their agricultural perspective, had no idea about the nature reserve. This is the meadow after we've taken out the charlock. A few Oxide Daisies came through, poppies, disturbed ground weed, and some sorrel, and the beginnings of fool's parsley. And then fool's parsley, another arable weed, became abundant throughout July. For those who didn't know, they thought it was a beautiful meadow of yellow flowers, followed by a beautiful meadow of white flowers. For us, it was total disaster. We did actually put sheep, not in Betty's or Marjorie's, but we had sheep out on the field to see what it felt like to have livestock on site. In fact, the electric fencing was stolen. We didn't like it, and we felt that actually being veganic without livestock helped us to be independent, but also more ethical. 2010, year 2. In May 2010, we had much more success. We were weeding out the occasional dock, hogweed and thistle, but apart from that, here you can see lots of lovely sorrel and buttercups and the first of the Oxide Daisies. When we talk about creating a meadow, many always they bring up the subject of yellow rattle. And this is the little one in the middle with the yellow flowers amongst the buttercups around with the slightly spiky leaves. Well, they look spiky, they're not spiky. There, you know what I mean. Yellow rattle is partly parasitic on grasses, other plants but mainly grasses, in that its roots attach to the grass roots, taking water and nutrients and suppressing their growth. The figure is that it can suppress the growth of grass by up to 60%. So in doing so, they give space for other wildflowers instead of having lots of thick grass in there. But of course it only gets going when you've got grasses. We'd taken out the grass and then we were starting from scratch with not just ryegrass, but with a mixture of many different grasses, wild grasses. But we were really pleased to see in 2011, in the second year, we had yellow rattle coming up. By June, the Oxide Daisies were getting going. They're often evident at the start of a meadow's life because although they do fairly well in settled ground, they do quite like disturbed ground. So if they've got bare soil around their roots, they're quite happy. So you often see them when you're starting out. We did see the grasses coming through, and here you've got common knapweeds and ribwort plantains. But the most important, the most exciting thing was by 2010, we were seeing a huge increase in the number of butterflies and bees. This is a common blue, the underside, the underwing of a common blue. Year 3, this is April 2011, and we were getting a few other species in there, just coming by themselves. The little fuzzy brown one, not a plant, just by the date there, is a foxtail grass, and then the pink is red campion. But in June 2011, you can see sorrel coming through, the red ones in there, but the daisies were really starting to have a field day. So this is Betty's and Marjorie's meadow with the daisies at their height. They never got this strong again. This was their year of success, year of glory. They need a well-managed meadow to keep thriving, really, Oxide Daisies. You'll find that they just become a part of the mix otherwise. In June 11, we had our first bee orchids, which arrived just by themselves. What we found is that some people are scared of disturbing the ground once they're starting to create meadows because they think that if they disturb the ground, the bee orchids won't come through. But actually what we found is that bee orchids were only coming through on the edges between the mown verges and the wildflower meadow, or around woodland areas where we had planted trees. A few came in the wildflower meadow, but only when there was enough space. They like light and they like shelter. Some natural burial grounds and nature reserves don't mow paths for environmental reasons. They don't want to use the mowers. But we found that actually the mown areas create different habitats, so you get a richer biodiversity. This is July 2011, and you're starting to see, this is year 3, you're starting to see meadow a bit like we have it now. When you have a wildflower meadow, you need to mow and clear it once a year and remove all the arisings, what you cut off. And in those first years, how were we cutting the meadow? Well, every year we hired in a flail mower. This is September 2011. And we asked the stronger people in the team to push these enormous machines and hired flail mowers. We found that every year they broke, something went wrong, we couldn't get them on the right days, but we persisted. We cut it, and then we needed volunteers to rake it up and clear it. And this was our first year, This wasn't the first actually, but this is the first photo I could find. A crew of likely suspects there, raking up, and we composted, actually. We put a big compost heap and we composted all of the arisings. Nothing else we could do with it. 2012, and we had been planting daffodils and other native bulbs, and they're starting to come through. Native daffodils, the Narcissus pseudo-Narcissus lobularis, is the Lent lily, and sometimes it can come up green for 2 or 3 years before it flowers. Unlike bulbs grown so that you plant them and they flower that spring, which are pumped up, the native bulbs just need to get their roots down, get their own nutrition, work themselves out. They're proper wild flowers. And they'll only flower when they're ready. June 2012, again, you can see there's not that mass of Oxide Daisies. It's starting to look like a proper balanced meadow. A stronger diversity of plants coming through, including ones that weren't in the original flower mix, which was like this hedge breadstraw, which is the fluffy white one. And it's starting to get well seedy. So here in August 2012, you can see that it's seeding well. But leaving the meadow until mid-August was always hard. Many eyes, visitors, people looking to berry folk, coming in August, thought it just looked messy. Weeds, you can see in here, we've got dock, the tall ones, which, we were taking out. And you've even got ragwort, the big yellow one at the top. But you can also see some really important flushes of end-of-season flowers like this yellow at the bottom, the meadow vetchling and bird's foot trefoil. And the butterflies are putting eggs, they're laying eggs into these end-of-season plants like bird's foot trefoil. And if you cut it too soon, they've got nowhere to lay their eggs. So, in other words, you lose a whole generation of butterflies. Cowslips were in our original mix. This is 2013, and it's not until about 2013, that's year 5, that the cowslips really started to get going. They were in the original mix. 2013, it's doing well. You can see it looking like it's starting to look like it does now. 2013, we had our first pyramidal orchid. Again, orchids just do what they want. They come as they want, they go as they want. You can't do anything about them, except allow them space to be. And pyramidal orchids, again, like bee orchids, they like a bit of space, a bit of light in undisturbed ground. Meadow cranesbill, that wasn't in the mix either, but that arrived. And the greater knapweed, which wasn't in the original mix, and that came in too. Becoming more confident as the years went by about leaving the meadow till later. So we were starting to mow, instead of at the end of July, beginning of August, we were starting to mow at the end of August, beginning of September. So we found we were getting plants like betony coming through, which are late season flowerer, and the field scabious with 2 lovely little meadow browns. And really starting to understand the beauty of the grasses. Here you've got Timothy going to seed. There's that purple seed down the spikes of Timothy. And what else can you see in here? Crested dog's tail. With the tall spike on the left by the tree. And you've got Yorkshire fog in there going to seed. We were seeing by year 7, not just, this is what our wildflower seed meadow is doing this year, but seeing the difference, what happened when you had a cold spring, when you had a warm spring, a wet winter, a dry winter, a wet or a warm, wet summer, and sudden bursts of heat. For example, having sudden heat, the flowers just suddenly go to seed. Everything just gives up. Even if it's in the end of June, July, everything will just go to seed. Whereas if it carries on gently with sunshine and not too much heat, you can carry on the flowering of the meadow into the beginning of August. We were also seeing more Oxide Daisies when the winter was really cold. That was because you've got more puddling or messing up of the meadow as people walk over it, because you've got frost on the soil, and you haven't got thick grasses which are staying there and protecting the soil. So you get a bit more bare soil, new things come, and the Oxide Daisies do better. So all kinds of things we're starting to learn about the process, which might be totally different on another site, with different weather conditions, different soil, and the whole thing. 2016, our cowslips are beginning to do really well. And so are our grasses. Here you can see the foxtails and the buttercups. So the buttercups coming through, but all of those are early flowering grasses. Those are all meadow foxtails. Beautiful. Some, I can just see actually there's some sweet vernal grass in there as well. Another early one. 2017, it really does look like the meadow that we know and love. Plenty of hedge bed straw in pockets. Don't know where it came from, but it's happy there. And grasses. You can see a lovely grassy mix, wildflower meadow. Musk mallow, another plant that just arrived by itself. It took 8 years to come, but then it did. And now we have little patches of musk mallow around. Beautiful, really fluffy leaves and pink. Wild basil, we have planted some, but the only reason we've planted and sowed wild basil is because the first lot just came by itself. And not came by itself with families planting some on a grave, because we'd know, because it would be on a grave. Wild basil that just turned up somewhere where we know no one would have planted it. So we thought, oh, okay. So I started to sow it, offer it to families and seed it. Graves, well, people say, well, what happens to the wildflower meadow when you're burying? Because you're digging a, whatever it might be, 3 foot by 6.5 foot block into the, going down 3 or 4 feet and taking that out. What we found is that mowing and keeping an area mowed will destroy the wildflower meadow in a season. Digging out a chunk for a grave, turning the soil over, so it's a mixture of topsoil and subsoil, which lowers the fertility and the plants like it. Within 2 years, it's completely happy. So it takes a lot longer for the meadow to recover from a seasons of mowing than it does from actually digging a grave in the midst of the meadow. Don't mow. Yellow rattle. This is all a section of yellow rattle. So instead of being able to take a picture of, ooh, there's one, and I've taken a little picture, I've been able to take a picture and show you that it's really good and spreading. Some areas much richer, some areas not, but it sheds seed early, and it can start to set seed, even in mid-July, mid-June sometimes, mid-July, mid-June, late June, which is great. Of the original seed mix, just 3 of the 24 that were in the mix have not been recorded. In other words, we've not seen them in Betty's and Marjorie's meadow. 2 of them, they're elsewhere on site. It's just because it's too dry in that area of the site. One of them we've never seen, which is small cat's tail. And I notice I've looked at the same mix from the company that we bought it from, and they no longer put small cat's tail in, so I'm wondering if people said, oh, it never comes through, don't worry about it. The ones which are where it's not damp enough were ragged robin and meadow sweet, which you don't really see in this area of the burial ground. And we allow it to get really nice and seedy and messy. So this is August 2019, year 10. You can see the trees growing up behind there. And you can see the meadow vetchling, that yellow, last flush of yellow. And then last year, all the cowslips. And the grassy nature of it's just beautiful. And that's June. And another one in June last year. And then this last one on Betty, I'm just going to move on from here, but Betty and Marjorie, this shows you the value of the verge. So we don't mow the verge just so it looks tidy. We do sometimes. We mow verges so people know that we're managing it. If it's all wild, then they say, well, they're not doing anything. If you manage verges and mow paths through, they say, well, they must have left this wild on purpose. It's not just that, it's also that you can see that the difference between, on the left, the grasses and the daisies and the knapweeds, and then in the bit which was mown maybe 2 weeks ago, you've got little daisies, you've got clovers, you've got bird's foot trefoil, you've got all kinds of lovely things in there, a different habitat. Really important. And the verges especially so, because the paths people walk on, but the verges, we ask people not to walk on the verges. So let's get back to those rakers. So every time we cut the grass, every year, we needed to get rid of all of those arisings. So I'm just going to go through what do you call it? A gallery of thieves. Is all our lovely volunteer rakers. Rogues. Rogues gallery, that's it. Stealing our hay. Anyway, 2012. 2013. 2014. This is September 2014 and October 2014. So we were really doing it quite late that year, seeing as how much seed we could get to actually drop in the meadow before we took it off. 2015. And then we gave up. In 2016, we gave up with the hired flail mowers. They were just such hard work, and they really weren't up to the job, I think because the meadow was getting thicker and richer. So we asked local farmer Michael Gibbs to come in with his small tractor, and he cut, and crucially, he baled the hay. That was taken from standing, I think it was David standing on top of the roundhouse. I think he wasn't up there just for fun, he was fixing something, but he went up there, which is quite fun. You can see Michael having fun driving around and around and baling it. There were other areas, so 2016 you saw there were rakers in 16 and 17. There were areas where the tractor couldn't go, which we were raking, but also it meant that we were taking that hay, this is one of our volunteers, Jane, taking the hay and actually shaking out the seed or moving it onto bare graves, to new graves, to shake the seed out on the graves and other bare soil around. That's the tractor, I just couldn't resist because it's such a wonderful beast. 2017 baling, that's David showing off. And all of those years we took the bales up to Red Wings Horse Sanctuary, up the main road. The horses didn't much like it. It's more litter. I mean, if you're cutting hay in June, July, August, June, July, you've got rich hay, it's lovely, the horses will eat it. When you're cutting in August, it's really what they call litter, a litter meadow. Most of the seed has already fallen, it's not great nutritional value, it's a bit spiky. The donkeys loved it. So we were feeding the donkeys at Red Wings. And they were really happy because, you know, it's free hay for them. And that's our motley crew from 2017. I don't find one in 2018. I think it was just us that did it. And there's me looking like I've done half or a third of the work. In fact, I just took the rake from David while he took the photo. But you can see that we're collecting these up, and then those bags will very immediately, they'll be taken and spread around where we needed. But on the main area of the burial ground, the farmer was still coming in and taking hay, because that was 10, 12 acres, 14, 12, going down, but it was a lot of acreage of grass, and he was still taking the hay. One of our frustrations was trying to find advice from someone who wasn't coming from a farming background. Because even going to Warwickshire Wildlife Trust and saying, how do you deal with grassland in a nature reserve, they gave us farming advice. You need livestock, you need to cut it, this is fodder, you know, and we couldn't deal with that. We just didn't want to do it. So we thought we had to find out a way of doing it ourselves. We couldn't find anyone who was doing it without livestock. And cutting it, when you're cutting for livestock, you're clear cutting. And I know you talk about clear cutting woodland, which is dreadful, but for me, cutting 10 acres of hay is like clear cutting. You're destroying habitat, huge areas of habitat, albeit for tiny, tiny creatures. These tiny, tiny creatures are what allows us to survive. So we stopped. We decided to stop and do something else. The next area we looked at, I'll go back to what we did in the whole site, but the next area we looked at was creating an acre and a half, a further acre and a half of wildflower meadow. This is called Michael's Meadow, because the first person to be buried just up from that circle was Michael. In 2017, we marked it out. That's what it looked like. You can see not a lot in there. That's August 2017, after the hay's been taken off in June, not much coming through. So we wanted to look at green hay. We looked at different options for green hay. We found a nature reserve close by, but the pH of the area, which was clean of weeds, was wrong. It was too acidic. No point. Nothing that came off would grow on our soil. The area which had a similar pH had too much creeping thistle. Again, no point. We would have just been putting creeping thistle all over bare ground, which is just what it wants. So what we thought we would do is just go with bare ground again, the bare ground bit. We tried without herbicide. We're fairly sure we tried this one without putting on herbicide. We can't remember exactly, but I can't find any record of having the herbicide in our accounts or in our notes. So we decided, I said, no, I can't do that. We won't do it with the herbicide, but we will just plough, harrow and sow. And you can see what problems we had because of that. Possible problems of bare ground, quality of seed and weeds. So this is it ploughed and harrowed in 2017. I've called that year 0. And seeding. Now in this one I'm sat at the van measuring out cup loads of seed, while this is Dorcas, one of our volunteers, and David taking certain amount, pacing, so know exactly how much seed to throw per area of pacing, and it's lined out so they know where they're doing. It's a meticulous job. It's not just your peasants going out there and just going like that, because your peasants going out there and doing it have done it, and their mothers and grandmothers have been doing it generations. We didn't have that learning, so we had to measure it and work it all out. The seed mix was different from Betty and Marjorie. Why? We spent some time carrying out research, looking at local nature reserves, also at field margins and verges, not the field margins which have been sowed by people getting subsidies, but natural field margins and natural verges. And also we had done some work for Warwickshire County Council on their habitat biodiversity audit, looking at the squares around us, the 4 local squares, and saying and listing exactly what's in the fields, in the margins, in the hedgerows, in the woodlands, everything for their records. It's a great job. Volunteers go out and do it. This time, we found that what we had used, the standard seed mix for clay soils, had things in it which we weren't seeing locally, native. They're native to the soil, but we just weren't seeing them. So we shifted the seed mix, made a custom seed mix, and with some help from you, because wildflower seed costs about £1,000 an acre for a standard mix. So for a custom mix, we were well over £1,500 for an acre, and we were doing 1.5 acres of seed. So we had our custom mix that we believed would be more native to Lower Tysoe Field, to Whipple. Do you remember the beast from the east? This is March 2018. We had cleared the soil and we had sown it. And then a huge amount of it was washed away because the beast from the east laid a thick layer of snow and then melted and took the topsoil off. This is July 2018. Do you remember the rest of that year? July 2018, it scorched. So not only did we lose a lot of seed in the beast from the east, but then we had a scorching dry late June, July, August. And of course a lot just went. Lots of bare earth still. Even though we had bare earth, this is September, we still had to deal with creeping thistle. Because we'd ploughed, without having sprayed it out, we think, we had root of creeping thistle all over Michael's meadow. We could have left it and seen what happened. We might have ended up with a field of creeping thistle, but we decided not to risk that. So there's David topping spear thistle and taking out creeping thistle and topping. It was quite a job. 2019 began more gently. This is year 2. This is April. Many native wildflowers are biennial. So the rosettes of basal leaves of the flowers of the plants come up one year, and then the next year the flowers come up. If they're perennial, chances are they'll do the same thing. In the first year, you'll just get the basal leaves. So you have to be patient. So people were saying, well, look at the state of it. You know, you need to be putting in loads more seed. You need to be planting more. And I said, no, we have to wait to see what happens. And we did. We just waited. And 2019 was much better. You can see 2019 in May, and there you've got the ragged robin, because it's a damper space because we're going downhill. Lots of buttercups. Can you see the edge of our area where the grassland is beyond? You can see the mixture, the rich biodiversity. That's just in year 2 compared with the grassland beyond. This is June and the first Oxide Daisies. You see a bit of red campion as well as the ragged robin in there, and the sorrel. And then the thick of the Oxide Daisies with an arable weed. A pretty one, cornflowers, which I had sown because I knew that we had disturbed ground, so may as well put in some pretty arable weeds. Of course, they won't come back again, but they're lovely. And the not so pretty arable weeds, like all the Chenopodium, this is common orach. We got red goosefoot. This is many-seeded goosefoot. There were also toadflax, speedwells, fool's parsley, dead nettles, charlock, all kinds of wonderful things in there. We spent ages on our hands and knees just identifying, this is a different kind of plantain, this is a different kind of that and that. They didn't come back because they were only there because it was bare ground, including this lovely little one, the Scarlet Pimpernel. They're wasteland and arable weeds. September 2019, we found a local young lad called James, who had small machinery that was willing to get involved in the project. I'll come back to what he was doing. But he came in and cut. It was too much for us to ask Michael Gibbs to do. I'll tell you why, because he never let us pay him. So we couldn't ask him to come in and do 3 times as much work. We couldn't do that because he wouldn't let us pay him. So we asked James who we could pay to do the work. Young lad setting up his own business. This year we did put in some more seed, but in October 2019, because I had given areas a chance and now I was replacing where the beast from the east had taken the seed off from the top. We put in a few things that we liked: cowslips, white campion, tufted vetch, marjoram, and field scabious. 2020 proved to be much more successful. While our woodland areas, our little trees, really suffered from the very hot, dry spring in 2020, the meadow was fine. And this is May 2020. Plenty of ragged robin still, ribwork plantain, and the buttercups are happily re-establishing themselves after they've been ploughed over. And this year, year 3, was our flood of Oxide Daisies. Do you remember I said that happened? It was year 3 in Betty's and Marjorie's, year 3 in Michael's. It's not a balanced wildflower meadow. In some ways, this is a pictorial meadow. It's there because of the bare ground. It's there because its roots were nice and hot. And everyone came from miles around. It went viral everywhere, and people came to see our meadow, and we had to say, it's not what we were after. But you can see the difference here. Now on the grassland, the buttercups are coming through, a bit later, but you can see the Oxide Daisies in Michael's meadow. And you can see how excited I am about grasses coming through, that I take pictures of grass. Yeah, we've got grass coming through in Michael's meadow. Here's beautiful ones. You've got, looks like red fescue, and Yorkshire fog is the tall ones, and the red fescue is the red ones underneath, amongst the Oxide Daisies. And once the Oxide Daisies started going over, and the brownish stalks at the top are daisy going over, you've got lots of yarrows, knapweeds, tufted vetch, and the grasses that were there are starting to deplete. July, here you've got a griminy coming through, that spear of yellow, just beautiful. Field scabious is also coming through, knapweeds, trefoils, but still not that many grass. And because it's wet down there, the ground became saturated. Grass is needed to create a good soil structure and to take up the water, the moisture in the soil. The wildflowers just don't do it. Late August 2020, and James comes back with his flail collector, cutting and gathering up the meadow. So there's no need for raking, it all happens in the back of his machine. And this is this year, year 4. The first cowslips are starting to come through, but not enough really for me to get excited and take photos. The most pictures I'm taking are still of grass. May 2020 here, that you see lots of ragged robin in the buttercups. But also, can you see those little spikes? That's Meadow Foxtail. So I didn't take this picture for the ragged robin. I took this picture because I was excited about the Meadow Foxtail starting to come through. A few other species are coming through. The Oxide Daisies are not as dominant, and here you've got, it looks like common vetch, but actually it's grass vetchling. Yorkshire Fock and Timothy. Timothy strands are coming up like that. And lady's bedstraw, just in the bottom right-hand corner, and here, the yellow of lady's bedstraw. And actually you can see a few spikes here of crested dog's tail. Probably why I took the photograph, but the bedstraw was in focus and not the grass. July, agrimony. Libby will know that we was wandering around doing the flora survey saying there isn't any agrimony yet, and then suddenly I was like, agrimony! And then suddenly it was everywhere, which was brilliant. And you can see the tufted vetch. And the wonderful thing about this tufted vetch is it's in a whole cloud of another grass, common bent. Grasses that you don't get in a field of pasture for cows, which is just ryegrass with the bits of Yorkshire fog. Common bent, a beautiful fine grass. And as we left the meadow long enough, field scabious, meadow scabious, field scabious. It's just starting to look like a proper wildflower meadow. This is July. This year we didn't have problems with creeping thistle, partly because David kept on top of it quite well, but partly because we've been keeping on top of it for 2 or 3 years. But we're also quite vigilant. This year we knew that the problem would be bristly oxtongue. And we got big patches of bristly oxtongue, and it was going to seed, and we knew we had to get rid of it. So David spent a good few days pulling bristly oxtongue, which is a very bad photograph of this, but you can just about see it in the foreground. As a biennial, if you pull it without it seeding, then chances are you'll stop it from becoming dominant. And it's lovely, going to seed. Michael's meadow there, with grass in it, going to seed. Very exciting. But all of this needs to be removed. What are we doing with all this hay? We started with 1/2 acre of hay from the first areas of Wildflower Meadow. Now we've got another 1.5 acres. So the management of woodland to be, or grassland that's going to be woodland, grassland to be woodland areas at sunrising is very different from management of grassland that's going to be Wildflower Meadow. So when we were just taking a clear cut of hay, we just were dealing with it all in the same way. But when we decided to just stop clear cutting the grass, to manage it in ways where we knew which areas would be woodland and which areas would be Wildflower Meadow, and manage them differently. In areas of Wildflower Meadow, you need to take the hay off and take it away, because you don't want any hay to leave to mulch down and increase the fertility of the soil. In areas which are going to be woodland, it doesn't matter. You can keep some richness in the soil. We also didn't feel that we wanted to be taking hay off anymore and giving it to, other folk to be feeding. We should be independent and autonomous as a nature reserve instead of being dependent on anyone else. We should be able to work out how to do this. So we're trying, we're learning, we might be getting it wrong, but our process at the moment is this. So what you're seeing in front of you here, the woodland at the back there is what we call Seth's Wood. In other words, if you stand at the roundhouse and you turn right to the lane, then on your left-hand side, as you walk towards the War Memorial, is Seth's Wood. That's Seth's Wood there. And the bit in front of it will be more of Seth's Wood. It will continue in this direction. That's going to be woodland. So in early August, this was just grass, we cut it, flailed it, and we just left it to mulch down. Just left it in the grass. This year we could do that because it wasn't too wet. If it was really wet and the grass was really thick, we couldn't do it. It would have created just heaps of mucky, rotting grass. But by the time we cut it in early August, as you can see from the grass on the left, it was already quite depleted. So we just cut it and we let it mulch down, this litter meadow. In fact, a month later, it's all gone. The piles of mulch you see here are from another area. So we've cut another area, I'll come to it next, called the Torch. We've cut an area which will be Wildflower Meadow, and we've put all of the grass on there, but we cut it in late August. So there's very little there. We just want to get it off the Torch and put it somewhere, so we put it here. And all of that pretty much gone by now. It's only 2 weeks gone, and most of it's already burning off and mulching in. In a traditional hay meadow, you can see this area is all greened up after it's been cut and mulched. In a traditional hay meadow, that's when you put the animals back on, and they'll start to eat that grass. But what we've done is, we're not using animals who will leave their droppings and fertilise the soil. We're putting on more grass. And here's the Torch. So this is the area which we call the Torch, just because of its shape. When the first person is buried there, then we're coming out of time. Okay. When the first person's buried there, then it will get its real name, but we're still calling it the Torch. And this is the last area of Wildflower Meadow that we're creating. Can you see the position of the longhouse that I spoke about in the AGM? That little blue box. So the longhouse with its glass windows will look all the way down the Torch. And this time we're using green hay. Green hay requires an established wildflower meadow to take the hay from, with similar moisture level, with a similar pH, or identical pH ideally, similar identical soil texture, with the appropriate range of native plants, without unwanted weeds or seeds, which can be cut at just the right time for seed collection, where it can be transported to and spread on the recipient meadow within a few hours. Pretty complicated, hey? So when we began in 2008, we didn't even consider green hay for Betty and Marjorie, and with Michael, it was just too complicated. We looked into it and we couldn't find it, as I said. So for the Torch, we decided, hang on, we have got green hay. We've got our own green hay now. We don't have to go out. We can be autonomous again. We can use our own hay. So you need a ratio of 1 to 3. In other words, 1 acre of meadow cut can be spread over 3 acres. And Betty's and Marjorie's is about half an acre, and the Torch is about 1.5 acres, so it worked out well. The compromise is that you have to cut the wildflower meadow in mid-July while it's still green, so it's seeding, but the seed hasn't dropped. Because once the seed's dropped, you're not taking anything with you when you cut it, or very little. So instead of cutting in late August, you need to be cutting in mid to late July. We didn't want to do that, which is why you should only take hay for green. You only take hay for green hay once every 3 or 4 years from a meadow. You need to let the seed drop in its own space. This is the Torch, pretty much standing where the longhouse windows will be. You can see why we were looking at that view. You can also see that we cut the torch in 2019 because you can see the edges of it. Long grass, which hadn't been cut, and then the torch in the middle with lots of red fescue. That's 2020. And this is James with his tractor heading out to cut the torch. A month or so later, the area just in front of him is the new car park. And this is the torch cut, hay dried, road baled, and actually that year it was all taken off. Not this year. This year it went onto our grassland to be woodland. But then it was all taken off to feed local organic sheep. This is 2020. Green hay from Michael's meadow was then put onto grassland to be, but green hay from Betty's and Marjorie's was deposited on the torch. And this is there in heaps waiting to be spread. This is not a good green hay technique. This was us keeping the hay in-house. And it was a lot of work, because green hay requires the recipient meadow to be at least 50% bare soil. You're not ploughing, but you're scarifying or using chain harrow or livestock, which you need to get sorted a few weeks before the hay comes in. And green hay needs to be spread within a few hours. They say within an hour, at the most half a day from it being cut. Otherwise, the heaps or the bales just heat up and the seed becomes infertile. So we managed neither of those this year. Not because we tried, we didn't try. But we weren't worried. We're still playing. We're still working out what works in terms of logistics and in terms of seed all round. We're in no hurry. This is that lovely view again. When you spread green hay, it can be necessary to clear off all the arisings. So you pour on the green hay, and then you need to take off what's left a few weeks later when there's nothing left. But actually, when we spread it, there was nothing left because what we put on was too late anyway. So it just burned off. And maybe there's no viable seed in there. Maybe it's coming through. Now and then you'll see little pockets of daisies or things like that in the torch, but not much, or in other areas. But we do have yellow rattle coming into the torch already. That's not from the green hay, that's from David taking a hoover, it's actually a seed vacuum, to collect yellow rattle from areas which have a lot of yellow rattle, and just putting it up. And again, we're just experimenting, seeing what works. But the fact that it's here means it does work. And here you can see the yellow rattle in the torch, albeit in little pockets going to seed. This is July 21, just a few months ago. There's James with his slightly bigger tractor. This is August, a month ago, cutting and mulching the to-be woodland areas in early August, and in late August, spreading the hay from Michael's meadow over those areas, and Betty's in the torch. So Betty's and Marjorie's hay was in the torch, and that's David, in fact with Libby's help too. Spreading the hay by hand. So that's David with his hay fork, his pitchfork, spreading the hay. I'm coming to an end. Next year, our intention is, or maybe the year after, it depends on the weather, and it depends on whether James can get the necessary equipment and how much energy we've got. Because for equipment, you need a forage harvester to cut and take up all the seed, and then you need a muck spreader, so David and Libby don't have to do 1.5 acres of pitching hay. But then we need to scarify, and we will need to cut Betty's and Marjorie's in mid-July, which is hard when it's on graves, and families are going, what? You took off all our flowers. So slowly we're going to be doing that. The torch will become our next wildflower meadow over the next few years. And then in maybe another 10 years, I'll be here saying, yes, and this is what worked. And do you remember what a fool I was? Because I just had. But we are learning. So here you've got the beautiful flowers. Field scabious, buttercup, common vetch, snake's head, fritillary, seed heads, in the middle, ribwort, plantain. You've got lovely sweet vernal grass, a stand in the middle. Oxide daisies and the yellow bedstraw. And I think that might be a plantain, maybe a broadleaf plantain. common Vluon clover, crested dog's tail grass, and hedge bed straw, not yet in flower. This is an Essex skipper on greater knapweed, lady's bedstraw in the back and Timothy, and the beautiful wildflower meadow. That's what we're looking at. The grass is in there, the flowers in there, the balance in there, and the sustainability and the autonomous nature of its maintenance within the project that is Sunrising Natural Burial Ground and Nature Reserve. Thank you.